Okay, so welcome to our lecture on Chapter 3, where we're going to start talking about risk, kind of like what risk are inherently involved in our decisions and like how we manage the environment, those sorts of things. We're going to look at economics, and then we're also going to talk about environmental concerns. So our outline here is we're going to first talk about making decisions, how we make decisions, why we make decisions that we do, characterizing risk, so how we characterize risk, environmental economics. We're going to look at economic versus ecological systems. We'll talk about economic tools that we use to address environmental issues, and then we'll finish up looking at economics and sustainable development. So, if we look at some of the major or the major resource, one of the major resources that we rely on, which is water, right? So we need drinking water, we need clean water, and oftentimes because of our economic impacts, that drinking water basically becomes unhealthy, right? And data published from the WHO, so the World Health Organization, says that about 1.7 billion cases of diarrheal disease result in about 500,000 deaths in children under the age of 5. One of the major causes of these infections is the ingestion of organisms in food and water that cause these infections. So a lot of these cases are directly tied to unsafe drinking water conditions for most of the time the poorer populations. The big key here is to provide safe drinking water and access to sanitation that helps separate those two. But a lot of people don't have them. A lot of people don't have access to them. And it's like one of the questions is, well, why isn't this the case? Why don't they have access to these things? Now, one of the kind of big barriers to accomplishing this is an economic one. If we look at the world's population and how much money they make and live on, roughly a tenth of the world's population lives on less than $2 a day. And you can't really provide your own safe drinking water and sanitary facilities with that low of an income. And so the poor populations are just at the forefront of this dilemma, and it is just not changing at the rate that it needs to change. Now, decisions that we make affect have big effects on examples like the water example we just looked at. And there are risks and costs to every kind of decision we make. And it's tied to that water example, one, because the people who make that less than $2 have to decide what to spend their money on. And most of the time, they're going to prioritize shelter and food and not really worry about whether or not they have sanitation and basically deal with the water resources they have. And so they make these decisions based off of their current situation. And all life decisions are like this, whether you're rich or poor or in between. You have a risk and you have a cost in most of these decisions. There are typically two factors of risk and cost that are interrelated, but you have to consider them. And so because they're interrelated, you have to consider them at the same time. So if you're making a decision related to environmental issues, characterizing the risk that people are going to get from those environmental issues, then you have to evaluate the cost of taking the action to eliminate that risk and the cost of doing nothing. Okay. So basically, we're saying that if you're going to do something related to the environment, there's a cost to reduce the waste, reduce the negative impacts, and then there's a cost to do nothing, right? So the risk is doing nothing, I should say, right? So you can risk doing nothing and get lucky and have no impacts, or get very unlucky and have lots of impacts that you may have to pay millions of dollars over later, or you can take the cost by eliminating those risks, right? And trying to reduce those risks. So the way you characterize risk is you look at the probability of a bad outcome. You think about what the consequences are if that outcome happens, and then you look at the cost of dealing with that bad outcome. And so all three of these kind of work together and they associate the risk. So the risk is the probability that a bad outcome or so a probability that a condition or an action that you do or your company does will lead to injury, damage, or loss, right? And this loss could be, human life, or it could be human resources, um, anything kind of related to kind of human well-being, those types of things, right? So you need to look at, okay, if I don't put in a water treatment facility, what's the probability that the water becomes polluted to a point to where it starts harming human life, right? So that's the consequence, harming human life. What's the probability that that happens? Now, what's the probability or what's the cost of dealing with that if that outcome happens? So how much will I have to pay, my company have to pay to correct that damage, that injury, and that loss, right? That loss of a water resource. That is the risk, right? And then you can weigh that risk against the cost of preventing it, right? Of trying to prevent that by, okay, so do I have a high chance, right? So probability that this will happen. And if that's a high probability with a very high cost, maybe it's better to spend money up front and build that wastewater treatment facility, right? Now, when we're talking about probabilities in this risk assessment, it's important that you understand the difference between probability and possibility, okay? So pretty much anything is possible, right? Quote unquote, anything is possible. A lot of things are possible. But the probability of that happening makes it seem like it's impossible, right? So, for example, probability is just a mathematical statement of how likely it is that something will happen. And so you'll generally hear like the probability of getting an illness is 1 in 10,000, or winning a lottery is 1 in 5 million. Now, this is the average outcome, right? You could play the lottery 7 million times and still never win it, okay? Or you could play the lottery one time and win it. This basically says that you have one chance out of 5 million chances to win the lottery, okay? So on average, you have to play 5 million times to win one time, okay? Is basically how that probability is working. But again, it could be higher or lower depending on chance and other factors that play in. And so again, we need to make a distinction between probability and possibility, right? Because probability is saying this mathematical statement of the likelihood of winning it. Whereas when we say something's possible, we're just saying it can occur. Probability is saying how often will that event occur, right? So how likely is it to occur? So two things could be possible, right? It's possible, you know, I walk out my front door today, or it's possible that I win the lottery, right? Um, the probability of me walking out the front door may be 8 out of 10, and the probability of me winning the lottery could be 1 out of 5 million. So we're looking at a super, super small percentage for winning the lottery, or an 80% chance that I'll walk out the door. So we would say it's highly possible, it's highly probable that walking out the door occurs versus winning the lottery, even though both of those are possible, right? They're possible, they both could happen. Which one is just more likely? The consequences of a bad outcome resulting from accepting a risk could be small, or they could be catastrophic, right? So let's say if you have wastewater going into a stream or a river, it could just lead to maybe eutrophication, where you have a lot of plants, you have a lot of algae growing, and you just kind of have to deal with that ecosystem change, right? That would just be the cost of paying people to go in and remove the unwanted stuff, and then you would have to like regulate the flow and that sort of thing, right? The catastrophic side of that is that you pollute the water so badly that it begins causing diseases in people, killing people, and that water resource is now unusable for a city or, a region, right? That is like worst case scenario, right? The economic cost, right, of dealing with those bad outcomes is a consequence, right, of accepting that risk. Okay. So if you take the risk of not building a wastewater treatment facility and something happens, that bad thing happens, that bad outcome happens, you have that economic cost tied to it. And the cost is going to be lower if it's minor, and it could be infinitely higher if it's catastrophic, right? So by not trying to prevent that outcome, you're accepting the risk associated with it. You're accepting the probability that there's a 50% chance that this is a catastrophic pollution or a minor pollution, right? Or 70% chance that it's catastrophic versus minor, right? And so you want to know those probabilities. And so that leads us to the idea of a risk assessment. So basically, an environmental risk assessment takes facts and assumptions to estimate probability that harm to people or the environment will come from your kind of doings, right? And so assessing the risk of a particular activity, chemical, technology, or policy to humans is really difficult, right? It's difficult to say what kind of outcome is going to happen if you let this, substance run into the river, right? And it may not seem like a bad substance, right? It may be like, a high amount of oxygen or nitrogen into the river. Um, so you don't really know if that's going to cause human disease, or what risk it would be, until you know the system and you know how excess nitrogen would affect that water system. And so you need a lot of information, a lot of tools to clarify the risk, right? So if the situation's well known, you can use statistics, you can use previous studies to estimate those risks. So like we know that if you add nitrogen to a water system, that it will increase phytoplankton growth, it will increase plant growth. You'll get a lot of biomass to fall to the bottom of the river, and then decomposition will happen, and oxygen will be used up, and it will lead to a dead zone in that area if enough nutrients is put in and it becomes eutrophic enough, right? And typically nitrogen's not too harmful for humans, but if it causes, say, like other downstream effects, it could be. And we don't know that unless we've done studies on that. Um, and another example, say, is miners developing black lung disease from coal dust. So we know this, it's well established, and we can inform the risk involved, and we can make actions to reduce that risk, right? That's associated with coal mining. And so risk management is where we go through this kind of decision process where we estimate and look at the risk. We take the risk assessment and we look at the actions that we can use to minimize or eliminate the risk, right? So for example, the water pollution example is we can minimize that risk by treating the water and making sure it's pure before we, release it into the river. Um, and so that risk assessment with that risk management strategy is part of this good environmental management systems. And if you're doing that in your business or industry, then you're taking good steps to be environmental friendly, but also be successful in your business and your profit margins. Risk management plans often include looking at scientific information, right, that gives the kind of risk that can happen. You have to decide how much risk is acceptable. Do I want a am I going to accept a risk only if a consequence is 10%, right? Or do I accept it if it's 30% probability of happening, right? How much risk is acceptable? And which risk should be given the highest priority? So, you want to prioritize, is it water pollution or is it, other wastes that are coming out of my factory? Which risk do I rank as the worst risk versus the least kind of worrying risk? And then you decide where the greatest benefit you would get by spending your funds on that risk, right? Because businesses don't have unlimited funds, so they have to prioritize and allocate their funds to the risk based off of their priority list. And then you ultimately decide, okay, these are our risks. This is how they're ranked. This is how we will minimize those risks using X amount of dollars. This person will enforce it. This group will enforce it. And then these people will monitor that. Okay. And so when we look at risk from a management standpoint, the biggest question is what degree of risk is acceptable? Most of the time we're not talking about zero risk, right? We're instead looking at negligible risk. We want that 1 in 5 million chance that this is going to happen, right? We want we want a decimal percentage that this is going to happen, right? But oftentimes that's not the case. So one of the biggest kind of factors for decision makers, public health scientists, is how to address the discrepancy of risk between the scientific and public communities. There are a lot of studies that have shown that environmental hazards affect the health status in a country are not really those that are receiving the highest attention. Okay. And so, for example, we have this graph here where the blue is the assessment of the public risk and the gold or yellow is the assessment of kind of professional scientists. Higher the bar, taller the bar, the higher that group associates that risk. Okay. So, for example, is shown to be super high for the public, but lower for the scientists. Radiation and hazardous waste sites, Um, where's another one? I thought there was another one. Those are basically it, right? Where the public is really valuing those as a high risk, but the scientists or risk assessors aren't. Then we have opposites like environmental loss, right? Invasive species, wetland loss, where scientists, risk assessors are saying these are really important, but the public's like, we don't really think so. Global warming is another one. Loss of habitat, population growth. All of these are environmental based risk. And a lot of it is the fact that the public is generally just not educated in how things like loss of wildlife ultimately affects them, how loss of wetlands affects their well-being, how invasive species can affect their neighboring ecosystems and change resource availability, water pollution, etc. So it comes from basically the discrepancy of public knowledge, and how they understand how these things are dealt with. And same thing for this scenario where the public looks as risk being higher than what the risk assessors do. And again, it's just that gap or difference in, oh, how do we control this versus what is it really doing? Right. And so the fundamental issue again comes from the proper role of the government, other organizations when it comes to matters of risk. So basically, one question you could ask is, what should the government focus on in terms of fixing problems? Should it focus on available resources and technology that could have the biggest impact on humans and ecological well-being? Or should it focus on what the public is most upset about, even if this is very little um, tangible impact, right? Do we make the public happy, even if it has very little impact? Or do we ignore the public and actually do and actually fix what could have the greatest tangible impact, even though they don't really understand why that's the case, right? So that perception of risk plays into risk management decisions and decisions on what you should fix at given times. And so next, we're going to kind of go into looking at environmental economics. Okay, so economics we define as the study of how people choose to use resources, produce goods and services, and how these goods and services are distributed to the public. Okay, so basically, we decide where resources should be put. Okay, and a lot of the times, environmental issues are economic issues, right? They're directly related, okay, and indirectly related, okay? So economists can look at resources as the available supply of something that can be used. So there's three kinds of resources. You have land, which is natural resources. You have human resources, such as labor. You have capital, which is just knowledge and technology, okay? Basically knowing how to make something available or to produce something, okay? Now, the land resources, the natural resources, can be divided into two categories: renewable resources versus non-renewable resources. Renewable resources can be regenerated by natural processes, typically within our lifetime, right? So this is soil, vegetation, animals, air, water, right? Non-renewable sources cannot be replaced by natural processes, or that rate of replacement is so slow that it doesn't happen within our lifetime or within the next couple generations as to where it can be effectively reused. And so because that process is so slow or so long, it's basically ineffective, right? So that's things like iron ore, fossil fuels, mountain landscapes, right? It takes thousands to millions of years for these resources to form. And so basically at a rate to where once we use them, they're pretty much gone. And so if we look at resources and we kind of look at supply versus demand and how this relates to economics, right? If you have a low demand, right, then your price is going to fall where that demand overlaps with the supply, right? So you have your supply line, which is 1-to-1. We have dollars per ton of corrugated cardboard if you're buying a ton, and then you have your supply, right? So if you want your corrugated cardboard, if it's a low demand, all right, sorry about that. Dogs again. So if you have a low demand, then your price is going to be low, right? And if you have high demand, right, your supply, right, is going to get lower because your demand is higher, so the price is going to go up in response to that, right? So the higher demand, the higher the price. Okay, so directly relate your resources directly related to economics, right? So supply is the amount of a good that you're willing to sell at a given price. Okay, demand is the amount or service that consumers are willing to buy. Okay, now you can price something stupidly high, but if nobody buys it, then you're not selling it, so it's not really being bought. So the demand, it really isn't there, right? So you have to price it to where it will be bought. And so the relationship between that supply and demand, right, is that supply and demand curve that we just showed. So if your demand is greater than your supply, then your price rises. If your demand is less than your supply, then your price lowers, right? So here we have the average price for corrugated cardboard, right? 2006, you can see lowering, then it goes up, and it lowers, goes up, and continually goes up, right? Probably because demand is just increasing and supply is either staying steady or decreasing, right? So your demand is getting higher than your supply. Now, we have other resources, right, that are like land, weather. Well, this isn't a resource, but basically in your resources, you have other inherent costs or inherent aspects that affect the cost, right? So for example, the price of food is determined by the cost of land, the machinery, the cost of the machinery, the cost of the fuel, the cost of the pesticides, the fertilizers to put on those fields, and then also the weather for that year. If there's a drought, then you're going to have less crops. Crops is going to be more. If you have really wet year, more crops, supply goes up, going to cost less that year, right? So the cost for the farmers to pay the land, the cost for their machinery and fuels goes into their production, and their yield ultimately determines the price of the food as well as how much money they put into making that food, right? You have these inherent costs that are also part of how much they are willing to sell those products, right? Now, it becomes really difficult whenever we start to, so for example, this price of food is much easier to determine the cost, right? Because we know how much that farmer pays for the land. He knows how much he puts into the machinery, the fuel, and the chemicals. And so he can set a price to give him a certain percentage of profit for that acre of crops, right? It becomes more difficult whenever we're assigning value to natural resources, Because we assign value of resources, these natural resources, based on our perception of their scarcity. Okay. If a natural resource is rare, it's expensive. Think of rare diamonds, that sort of thing. If the supply is very large and demand is low, the resource is basically free. And even these non-resources, or I'm sorry, these renewable resources can be overexploited, like water, right? So we can and do overexploit water a lot of the times. Now, ecosystems, we can give value to them, to those ecosystems, because they provide ecosystem services. So ecosystem services are a tangible source of wealth. So there's value there. The issue, though, is disentangling the complex interactions in those systems to commodity units, right? So that natural scientists and economists can describe those ecological changes in a way and provide value to each of those different units. Because they're so complex and intertwined, it's often hard to say it's worth this amount of dollars, right? So, for example, we have like the economic value of pollination service of honeybees and other animals is estimated to be about $200 billion per year worldwide. And this issue's been brought up because of the problems of domesticated honeybees and the issues that their populations have been having recently. So if honeybees go away, then we lose a significant ecosystem service in terms of pollinators for a lot of the crops that we grow. Now, environmental costs are also associated with our kind of actions, because we have pollution, we have species extinctions, we deplete our resources, we take the aesthetics away from an ecosystem when we develop it and dig it out or modify it, and all of these examples are examples of environmental costs whenever we exploit these resources. Environmental costs are also difficult to measure because, again, it's hard to convert these things to a monetary value, right? So how much are we losing when a particular species is gone? We know that for honeybees because we can kind of provide a value on the crops that they pollinate, but other species and other organisms is just not as easy, right? There are two types of costs that we can look at. So you have deferred costs. These are so these costs are ignored, not recognized, and they accumulate over time, and then eventually they'll be paid. Okay. So for example, the Colorado River has a dam, provides electric power, irrigation water, but it leads to loss of native fish species. Those costs will be paid at a later date. External costs are those that are brought up by someone other than the individuals who produce or consume that good, right? So basically our example of water pollution earlier. So a logging operation removes trees, that runoff destroys streams, causes mudslides. And so now, because the logging company made those negative impacts, they're not being affected by that. It's the people in the community who are being affected by the loss of water, potentially the destruction of houses due to landslides and mudslides and other issues. And so the logging company's not having to pay for those costs. The public and the community are. Then there is opportunity costs. And this happens when you have a decision that precludes potential uses for a resource. So the example here is if you have a house built in a forested region, the land's possible use as a natural area for hiking or hunting is lost. Right? Um, a lot of the environmental costs are including these three type of costs. So external, deferred, and opportunity costs. Okay. So we see these three types of costs all the time in our everyday kind of activities. Now, looking at the costs of pollution, right? So the economics of pollution. So pollution is basically when you add any kind of matter or energy that degrades the environment for humans or other organisms. Okay? Um, Usually when we refer to pollution, we're referring to something that is causing harmful issues to humans, so causing harm to human health. So like polluting our water or polluting the air to where it causes like, asthma or lung disease or, some other health um, disorder. And these pollution costs are often external. They're often private or public um, expenditures to where those are the ones that are correcting that pollution. So, for example, over time, industries and factories have burned fossil fuel and coal power plants and led to pollution. Right, the Central Valley of California, Southern California is one of the most polluted areas in the world, especially the United States. And the public deals with those pollution costs, right? The medical bills, trying to reduce, the stuff in the air is just difficult when you have these factories continuing to do it. And so it's these external costs that's provided to the community. Now, the pollution prevention costs will be taken up by the private sector. So, for example, the factory or the government to prevent pollution from happening or to reduce the amount of pollution, right? So, for example, the government would treat sewage before it's released into a river, and that would be a pollution prevention cost, right? So they're paying to prevent pollution to the river. Whereas if the river was polluted, then the public would endure some of that cost, right? So it would be an external cost. So the philosophy of pollution prevention is that it should be prevented or reduced at the source whenever feasible. This is big, right? If you reduce that, you reduce those external costs and you reduce the risk of having these catastrophes and having to fix it later. Okay? And so one big idea of this philosophy is that it shouldn't be an external cost by the public, right? And potential pollution should be internalized. It should be reflected in the price of the good or the service being provided. So like if making a product provides a waste that you have to pay to get rid of, then add that to the cost of the good. I would rather pay a little more money for something that I buy, knowing that it's keeping my environment, my resources, my water pure and healthy. Because if we don't do that, we could pay with our lives because of diseases and bad impacts that happen from that, or we could pay in a bunch of medical bills. And it wouldn't just be us, it would be other members of the community as well. And so I think that's a good kind of compromise in terms of that pollution prevention. Um, in terms of environmental costs, we've talked about a couple of these, the deferred costs, the external costs. One we haven't really mentioned is opportunity costs. Um, and so there is resource exploitation, right? So air pollution, water pollution, kind of any kind of pollution, depletion of a resource, that are all examples of environmental costs with resource exploitation. And so we're going to look at these three types of costs, right? which could be associated with this exploitation, right? So we've talked about deferred being deferred to later, external being put on the public. And I already forget, did we talk about opportunity? Yeah, we talked about opportunity costs. So, those that can reduce a cost by some sort of action, right? So a house being in the natural environment. So these three things together, right, are part of this exploitation. Okay. What we're going to look at now is a cost benefit analysis. Okay. So a cost benefit analysis is where we calculate the costs and benefits of a project or action or whatever resource we're providing to decide if the benefits are greater than the costs. If the benefits are greater than the cost, then you can profit from it. But if the costs are greater than the benefits, usually it's not worth it, right? In the U.S. in 1969, the National Environmental Policy Act basically said that environmental impact statements of major government-supported projects should have to be done, right? So they have to complete those environmental impact statements, okay? So as an example, right, providing clean water and improved sanitation, 2004, WHO published a cost-benefit analysis of providing clean water and improved sanitary facilities to people who don't have them. So basically it said that the medium level was modest and assessed the impact of providing clean drinking water and at least access to a pit latrine within a short walking distance from each home. So this is what they would provide, right? So they would have access to clean drinking water and a sanitation system that doesn't interfere with their clean drinking water. For this medium level of service, right, every dollar they spent to provide services would be $11 in benefits, right? So that seems like a pretty good dollar spent, especially if you are improving the quality of life of these people, right? You're giving them a source of drinking water that they don't have otherwise. Some people, though, argue that if only the measures of value is economic and you have non-economic values such as, aesthetics, so like beauty, serenity, recreation, or cleanliness are often overlooked and ignored in these cost-benefit analysis, right? And this becomes an issue when you have different cultures that have different opinions on the value of these non-economic resources, right? So some people just may not value quietness or beauty or aesthetics of a given location, whereas others may hold that as high value. And so the cost benefit analysis would be different for those two individuals, okay? And so what we see is that a lot of the environmental problems that we have are due to an imbalance of this socioeconomic system and the natural world, okay? And so basically what we have is economic and ecological systems differing on kind of this pyramid. So their time frames, their locations, their complexity, the units of measure. So basically economic aspects of these kind of categories are different than these ecological categories, right? And so here's a pretty interesting example of a resource problem. It's known as the tragedy of the commons, okay? So let's say everybody in a town shares ownership of a resource, okay? There's a tendency to overexploit and misuse this resource, mainly because if everybody owns it and can access it, you'll probably want to get more so that you can have your share before anybody else takes more than their share, right? And so this tragedy of the commons issue is inherent in this common ownership of resources and was outlined by a biologist named Garrett Hardin in an essay known as Tragedy of the Commons. Okay. In his essay, the commons were pasture lands in England, and they were given to the public by the king for anyone who wanted to use it to graze their cattle. Okay. No problems happened as long as the number of animals is small in relation to the size of the pasture. Okay. However, the issue comes is that it's optimal individual strategy to enlarge a personal herd as much as possible. So if you have a large herd, you have more meat, so you can have more resources. But if everybody has large herds, then the field will be overgrazed and then nobody will have herds. Okay. And so what we end up with is this idea or this fact that people will overexploit past their individual needs and will end up not having that resource instead of partitioning that resource. Okay. And so essentially what we have here is the ecosphere being a very large common. So the earth is a very large commons that everybody has ownership over, right? The US and other industrialized nations, we consume much more than our share of resources, right? And so this tragedy of commons is basically operating at a global scale, right? And also operates on an individual scale as well. I have this YouTube video here that does a really good job at explaining tragedy of the commons, and I'd like for us to take a look at it. All right, let me try something real quick. All right, we got it right here.
Imagine as a thought experiment that you live in a small village and depend on the local fish pond for food. You share the pond with 3 other villagers. The pond starts off with a...
All right, sorry, I had the dogs barking. I'm going to back it up just a little bit.
You share the pond with 3 other villagers. The pond starts off with a dozen fish, and the fish reproduce. For every 2 fish, there will be 1 baby added each night. So, in order to maximize your supply of food, how many fish should you catch each day? Take a moment to think about it. Assume baby fish grow to full size immediately, and that the pond begins at full capacity, and ignore factors like the sex of the fish you catch. The answer? 1. And it's not just you. The best way to maximize every villager's food supply is for each fisherman to take just 1 fish each day. Here's how the math works. If each villager takes 1 fish, there will be 8 fish left overnight. Each pair of fish produces 1 baby, and the next day the pond will be fully restocked with 12 fish. If anyone takes more than 1, the number of reproductive pairs drops, and the population won't be able to bounce back. Eventually, the fish in the lake will be gone, leaving all 4 villagers to starve. This fish pond is just one example of a classic problem called the tragedy of the commons. The phenomenon was first described in a pamphlet by economist William Forster Lloyd in 1833 in a discussion of the overgrazing of cattle on village common areas. More than 100 years later, ecologist Garrett Hardin revived the concept to describe what happens when many individuals all share a limited resource, like grazing land, fishing areas, living space, even clean air. Hardin argued that these situations pit short-term self-interest against the common good, and they end badly for everyone, resulting in overgrazing, overfishing, overpopulation, pollution, and other social and environmental problems. The key feature of a tragedy of the commons is that it provides an opportunity for an individual to benefit him or herself while spreading out any negative effects across the larger population. To see what that means, let's revisit our fish pond. Each individual fisherman is motivated to take as many fish as he can for himself. Meanwhile, any decline in fish reproduction is shared by the entire village. Anxious to avoid losing out to his neighbors, a fisherman will conclude that it's in his best interest to take an extra fish, or two, or three. Unfortunately, this is the same conclusion reached by the other fishermen, and that's the tragedy. Optimizing for the self in the short term isn't optimal for anyone in the long term. That's a simplified example, but the tragedy of the commons plays out in the more complex systems of real life, too. The overuse of antibiotics has led to short-term gains in livestock production and in treating common illnesses. But it's also resulted in the evolution of antibiotic-resistant bacteria, which threaten the entire population. A coal-fired power plant produces cheap electricity for its customers and profits for its owners. These local benefits are helpful in the short term. But pollution from mining and burning coal is spread across the entire atmosphere and sticks around for thousands of years. There are other examples too. Littering, water shortages, deforestation, traffic jams, even the purchase of bottled water. But human civilization has proven it's capable of doing something remarkable. We form social contracts, we make communal agreements, we elect governments, and we pass laws. All this to save our collective selves from our own individual impulses. It isn't easy, and we certainly don't get it right nearly all of the time. But humans, at our best, have shown that we can solve these problems, and we can continue to do so if we remember Hardin's lesson. When the tragedy of the commons applies, what's good for all of us is good for each of us. TED-Ed is a nonprofit.
All right, so that was just a really good video kind of summarizing Tragedy of the Commons and showing it in an animation that I feel explains it a lot better than I can with just text on a PowerPoint screen. Okay. All right, so we can use economic tools to address these environmental issues that we have. So for example, governments can use what's known as a subsidy, which is basically a gift from the government to individuals or businesses or, private groups to basically encourage actions that are not looked at as being important to the public. So for example, whenever you release wolves to Yellowstone and the ranchers don't think that that's a good idea because the wolves will eat their cattle, they can get subsidies for, say, cattle loss or, doing things to help the wolf population. Another example is ranchers and farm owners in the Central Valley can get subsidies for setting aside a portion of their land that's wetlands or vernal pool ecosystems to not be converted into ag land so that those ecosystems are remain intact. And so subsidies can be really useful when they have a purpose and are used for short transition periods to try to get from, say, not preserving vernal pool wetlands to kind of full, on preserving and having laws kind of guiding that. However, subsidies can be used and are used inappropriately and can lead to economic distortions. And what they can do is they can keep a price or a good below kind of true market value. They can encourage activities that are actually detrimental to the environment. And once the subsidies are kind of involved in the economic kind of framework, it's very hard to get those subsidies out of that framework. Other kind of methods we can use are market-based instruments. So governments can, try to reach these environmental improvements by generating regulations with penalties for those who don't comply, right? Um, so, for example, if you have a business that's not meeting their pollution regulations, right, then there's a penalty associated with that. Um, Governments are looking to economic tools and much more often. Um, and so these are known as market-based instruments because they're encouraging people to meet these environmental goals, right? And so basically what happens is you can, instead of using like inflexible directives, so like hard directives, you can use these policies to allow people and businesses to choose solutions that make sense to them economically just to achieve those regulations, right? So you can say that, all right, wastewater should only have this percentage of this chemical in it when it's put into the river. We don't care how you do it or how much money you spend on it, just meet this regulation. And so that business can choose the solution that fits them the best economically, but meets that regulation. Okay. Other things that they can do is have information programs, basically providing consumers about environmental consequences of things they are purchasing. Tradable emissions permits, so companies can have a right to emit a specific amount of pollutants, and then if they emit like lower than that, then they can trade those off. You have emissions fees and taxes. So if you are going to do environmentally damaging activity, it's going to be more expensive. You have deposit refund programs. So basically you have a surcharge on the price of a product that is refunded when the product's returned. And you have performance bonds. So these are fees that are collected to make sure that proper care is taken to protect those environmental resources. Okay. And so next we can look at like this life cycle analysis and basically extend product responsibility. So this is that recycling of waste, right? So a life cycle analysis is just where you assess environmental effects associating with production, reuse, and the disposal over its entire life. And so you can look at the kind of life cycle of a product and you can identify where you can change things to help reduce the environmental impact, right? So maybe change how it's disposed or change how it's distributed or how it's extracted. And that can kind of reduce the environmental impact. And there's also this idea of extended product responsibility where you have the producer of a product to be responsible for all the negative effects in the production. And this is ultimately disposal as well. And so the idea here is that if you have manufacturers pay for the post-consumer impacts, they'll alter designs to reduce the waste. Because if they reduce waste, then they don't have to pay as much. And so they're incentivized to reduce, their impacts so that they don't pay as much in the long term. One of the final things is just science, politics, and policy. So, we try to get environmental policy enacted, but in the United States, it tends to be fragmentized, basically because the policy is highly politicized, right? Just think about climate change. If you've ever kept up with that, fossil fuels versus renewable energy, how expensive is it? Who wants to use it versus who doesn't want to use it, etc. Um, so even though this is kind of a piece by piece or what you would call a piecemeal approach, um, there is a lot of evidence that suggests that science and technology related to the environmental issues are being accepted by community and the public, and that there are some good strides being made, but we still need to continue to do more, and kind of keep getting at our impacts in this way. And then the Sustainable Development has also become a really important priority for the world. So basically, sustainable development is development that meets the needs without compromising the future generations to meet their own needs, right? So basically, it can sustain itself, right? And future generations are going to be able to use it as a resource. Um, most most of the sustainable development definitions refer to natural resources and ecosystems over time, to maintain human resources, human standards, and economic growth. So basically, the ability of humans to use a resource from an ecosystem or reserve without overusing it and depleting it, and that resource will basically be there and be maintained. Um, One of the kind of common definitions that was developed in 87 is that sustainable development is the development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of the future to meet their own needs. Okay, so again, it's this idea of having this sustainable use over long term. And so basically, you have this kind of renewability with substitution of ideas, kind of this interdependence of these ideas and processes, being able to adapt and change based off of the outcomes, and then a commitment by the institutions to implement and provide this sustainability for these resources. Some issues and analyses that come up. So, for example, the economics and risk of, say, mercury contamination, right? So let's say you have like coal plants, bioaccumulation with toxic effects, and permits and trading, right? So basically, it's saying, should all pollution be prevented regardless of costs, or should risk assessments and economic analyses be part of the decision-making process? So all of these, right, parts have an issue and an analysis associated with them. And again, you're going to do that risk assessment to kind of figure out what is the best case scenario under this situation. Okay. And so that's it for chapter 3. Make sure you go through the summary so that you kind of take away the big ideas from this chapter. Again, this isn't everything you need to know, but it's a good starting point in terms of studying for this chapter. Okay. And with that, we'll see you in chapter 4.